course, using primary resource for medieval literature of tafsir and also modern tafsir. I think Bauer give us an excellent example on how to deal with the heritage of Islamic tafsir from medieval period and relate it to the work of modern, to the issue of modernity and also to the context of modern period. I think that's what I can say. Actually, in Bahasa Indonesia, I try to structure my sentences as good as possible, but I am using direct translation and many part of this text also I skip. So please forgive me for that shortcoming. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So, for audience, I will take over for the Mustard ceremony because my brother Fauzi, he will lead for the streaming live streaming. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we have come to the core agenda, and thank you so much for the Professor Kusmana for the keynote speaker, which is our core agenda is the lecturers today from the Dr. Karen Bauer and also the Professor Feras Hamza. Good evening from Indonesia, Prof. and Doctor.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having us.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for me. Okay. So the webinar will be moderated by Hamdi Putra Ahmad, Master of Philosophy from alumnus from University of Oxford, UK, the class of 2023. And this is some of the writings from Mr. Hamdi. Construction of Indonesian culture taught in Tafsir al-Azhar as Hamka's teaching practice. And then the second, the Quranic learning software in digital era, a trip toward the value of Quranic learning orthodoxy in Indonesia. The third, the new trajectory of the Quranic studies in Indonesia, a critical dissertation review. And then the before orthodoxy, the story of Abraham's sacrifice in the early Muslim commentaries and so on. So in this core agenda for Mr. Hamdi, and for the professor and doctor, time and place are yours.
Okay. Thank you very much from the Master of Ceremony, Mr. Rashad. Thank you very much for calling me. And good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's book discussion on women, households, and the hereafter in the Quran, a patronage of piety. My name is Hamdi, and I'm thrilled to be your host for this exciting session where we'll dive deep into the world of women in the Quran. Books have an incredible power to transport us, challenge our perspectives, and spark meaningful conversations. And today, we are fortunate to have with us the brilliant minds behind Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Quran, a patronage of piety. Please join me in welcoming our two esteemed authors, Dr. Karen Bauer and Professor Feras Hamza. Dr. Karen is an associate professor in the Quranic Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, IIS, in London. Her research centers on the Quran and its reception history, the history of emotions in Islam, and gender in Islamic history and thought. Dr. Karen is currently pursuing a cultural history approach to the Quran. Besides publishing this outstanding book on women, households, and the hereafter in the Quran, she has also published articles on subjects as diverse as emotion and emotional rhetoric in the Quran, women's right to be judges in Islamic law, and the audiences of tafsir. Dr. Karen is an active member of the International Quranic Studies Association, or ITSA, and is co-series editor along with Joseph Lowry and Shaukat Turawa of the book series Isaac, or ICSA Studies in the Quran, published by The Greeter. She is on the team of the Kitab Project at the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. Welcome, Dr. Karen Bauer. And then our second author, the second author of this book is Professor Feras Hamza. He is head of the School of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Wollongong in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And he is also a research fellow in the Quranic Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. He is the general series editor for the multi-volume anthology of Quranic commentaries, including Volume 1 on the Nature of the Divine with Sajad Rizvi and Farhana Meyer in 2008, and Volume 2 on Women with Karen Bauer, 2021. He is also an editor for the Brill series Islamic Literature, Texts and Studies. He has authored several historical articles on the early Muslim community, as well as articles on the epistemological and methodological approaches in Quranic and tafsir studies. He is currently working on a hermeneutics-based project entitled Time and Narrative in the Quran. So, ladies and gentlemen, during this session, we'll explore the inspiration behind the book, delve into its key methods, arguments, and findings. Towards the end, we will ask some questions, which we have compiled before the webinar from some expected audiences. But if we still have some times, we will open the floor to the audiences to ask some questions. So feel free to type them into the chat as we go along. Without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Karen and Professor Feras, welcome from Indonesia. We know that in London now is, I think, in the noon, yeah, and in Dubai, I suppose it is 4 p.m. now, so it's in the afternoon. And thank you very much for joining us today. So let's begin our webinar. Before we delve into some questions, could you please tell us about what inspired you to write this book? Maybe from Dr. Karen or Professor Feras.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having us, and thank you to Kausama for that kind introduction and that very generous his generous words about the feminist projects on the Quran. And I do have some comments on it, and I will get there eventually. So what had happened is that Professor Hamza and I, Feras and I, had collaborated on another project. Feras, I don't know if you have a copy of that anthology right near you. I mean, mine is just back there, and I could. So we had collaborated together on, as Kausama mentioned, I had prior to this written a book on called Gender Hierarchy in the Quran, on certain tafsir of certain verses on women. And then together, Feras and I decided to publish some of these Quranic commentaries, right? So it's the second volume in an anthology series of Quranic commentaries, and this volume is dedicated to women. So we took some verses of the Quran, and we didn't really analyze the Quran itself. We just analyzed the tafsir of this. And I think that, which is similar to what happened in my original project, a little bit similar, except that, of course, here we're publishing the translations. And then we did some interviews. I had done some interviews in Iran. We included a couple of those. And then we did some interviews together of some feminists to look at some of the modern interpretations of these verses. And I don't know if, Feras, you want to talk about what part of what happened then and why we decided to then we didn't exactly decide to write a book on the Quran. We had decided to gather together all the verses in the Quran on women because we didn't want to leave it with the tafsir tradition. We thought we need to understand actually what the Quran itself is saying about women. And Firas, I don't know if you want to add, if you have any words on why we wanted to make that transition.
Yep, thank you, Karen. Of course, thank you to our host for the invitation, and thank you to Professor Kusmana for that contextual lecture, kind of keynote, I suppose, to give us all background about how we are all approaching the Quran. I think the important thing is really just to start by thinking, what is it that we're all concerned with here, and surely it is concerned with understanding how the Quran is relevant. I think that in a sense is when we started reading the various verses on women in the Quran, we actually began to notice that the Quran gives a lot of place for women and the female subject. It's part and parcel of a number of themes. They're all interwoven together. And so women were not just and something that just appears in the Quran and is commented on. They're part of that call, the divine call to human beings to discover their moral trajectory, their moral journey. And so their partnership with men is just, it's kind of primordial, really. The trouble, of course, is that how to understand the historical moments in the Quran. And what does that mean for somebody reading it in the 21st century, as we all are now? And so we thought, well, let's see how far the Quran had gone in telling that story from, it is in its own time up to when the Quran stops. And we found there an evolution in the story. We found that women appear in the earliest verses, and are part of the exemplary stories told in the Quran about how somebody can be a pious exemplar, that is somebody who can model the kind of moral life that the Quran asks for. And then, of course, they appear as, the kind of the partner, really, إن الذين المسلمون المسلمات والمؤمنون والمؤمنات. They're just everywhere. I mean, they're together there with men, they're in the battle scenes, they're at the domestic scenes, they're in everything. So I think we realized that the Quran had gone on revealing for centuries after it would have said much more. The question, I think, for us was, can we say more than what the tafsir tradition has said? And we felt like we could.
Exactly.
And don't forget, before I hand over back to you, Karen, don't forget that the tafsir tradition can only say so much, because we always forget that the tafsir tradition, in a big sense, I know that there are still tafsirs that are being, kind of composed in the 20th century, but in a big sense, it ended in the medieval period. I mean, everything else that came after that was a repetition of what had gone on before. So it's not that there was a continuous tradition of reflection upon the Quran other than the tafsir tradition. And that tafsir tradition, because of its historical moment in time, came to be very much male-dominated and male-centric because of the scholars who worked on that tafsir. So naturally, we can't expect the kind of results from that tafsir tradition that I think we, as concerned, and I mean, both Karen and I, as engaged and invested readers in the Quran, would expect to find, given the wider message of justice and moral transformation that's in the Quran. There is no way that the Quran is going to discard women. So we wanted to know, well, how to read the Quran. And I guess this is where you could talk a little bit about that as well, Karen.
So I think that a really crucial point to make is that it's very easy to gloss over the problems in the tafsir tradition and to think, oh, it was really okay. It was really fine. But actually, when we look at what happens in the Quran and we look at what happens in the tafsir tradition, we notice some major discrepancies when it comes to the subject of women, especially. And that may not be true for other subjects, but it's definitely true on the subject of women. For instance, if you take a verse like Quran 4:34 that's clearly intended to limit men's power over women and to say that men do not have an unlimited power over women and they cannot treat them however they like. There need to be limits on what men do within marriage. Then you look at the tafsir tradition, and what do they say? They say, well, a husband could beat his wife even to the point of death, almost death, and only if he kills her, he gets some kind of retribution. I mean, this is not, I'm sorry to say it like this, but this was not Quranic. Actually, interpretations like that give men this kind of leeway are actually not Quranic. And so I think it's really important to understand that we started with the tradition and with tafsir, and we realized it was telling a different story from what we saw in the Quran. So that story is one story, and what's in the Quran is a different story, in a sense. It's not always that they never align. It's that you can't rely on the tradition to always align with the Quran. And so you need to take the Quran on its own terms in some sense. And so that's where we gathered together all of the verses on women in the Quran. And then we had to figure out some way of organizing this material. It was a lot of material, and material that actually you can organize that material in a number of ways. If you have all the verses in the Quran that ever mention women or the female or daughters or anything to do with women, including the mother of the cities, Qurra, or, you have to take into account all the mentions, right? And there's a lot of ways that could be organized. We decided to try to see what would happen if we tried a chronological arrangement. And this is based on some developments in the field of Quranic studies and the tools that are being used commonly by scholars of Quranic studies in the West, and we relied on the chronology put forth by Nikolai Sinai, which is a modification of Noldeka's chronology. Okay, and Noldeka himself relied a bit on the tradition, but Nikolai Sinai, what he does is he takes into account mean verse length, the length of verses, which he assumes gets longer over time, right? And so he has a more, I'd say, scientific approach. So we followed the chronology that he had proposed, and then we were able to see what happens. In fact, we didn't start out believing that chronology was definitely the right way to organize this material. It was the fact that actually then the material began to tell an important story once we organized it in that way. And that story began in the early Meccan period with a certain way of talking about women. And it ended in the Medinan period with a much more developed, and I guess that you'd say a much more, women obtained a much more prominent place in the Quran as the Quran developed over time. And we think that alone is a story that's worth telling. But more than that, as Feras said, the story that actually is told, the way that women are integrated into the text in each period, is also a very important story to be told. And I don't know, Feras, do we want to talk a little bit about the actual chronological development that we found when we organized it this way? Do you want to say a word, or do you want me to start saying with the early Meccan, give a broad overview of how we found it?
Go ahead.
Okay, so what we found, to give a broad overview, is that in the early Meccan period, we found a lot of mentions of the most mentions of women were things like the daughters of God, or were in a much more generic sense, like by he who created the male and the female, for instance, the oath, right, in Al-Layl. وَالَّذِي خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى. And for instance, so what we saw was mentions of women, and then we also saw mentions of women in paradise. Okay, so why is this important? Okay, what is going on here is that what we see is that God intentionally created both male and female, Okay, this is a huge part of Quranic rhetoric, that the male and the female are intentionally created equal, as equal parts of humanity, right? And then you see the pagans and how they treat women. So what the Quran says about how the pagans treat women is, it says that on the one hand, they worship things that they call daughters of God. On the other hand, they treat their own women very badly, okay? And so these pagans are thick, is what the Quran is saying. The pagans do not understand anything. How can the pagans do this? How can they treat women as though they're gods, but treat their own women like dirt, or worse? They bury their own infant daughters. They treat them worse. So what that tells us is that in the Quranic milieu, the Quran is trying to respect women the same as it's respecting men. And that comes out much greater in the later Meccan surahs with the afterlife, with the images of the afterlife. Now, in the early Meccan surahs, what you had is images of huris, right? And so this is like a kind of a this was an image that came from pre-Islamic poetry of women who are very attractive, okay? And in the pre-Islamic poetry, the poet would go after that woman, right? But the Quran is telling them, no, 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 stop right there. You don't go after that woman now, because what you do is you act as a very good person in society. You give charitably, you look after all the women in your life, addressed to men. But if you're good, then in the afterlife, you can have a reward. Now, in the later Meccan period, what we see is that women are equally promised a reward in the afterlife. Women and men are both promised a reward in the afterlife of whatever they want and whatever they wish for. And so those kinds of sensual rewards are in no way limited to men, because it uses the same language to describe what women can get in the afterlife. But what we have much more in the later Meccan period are the stories that have to do with women. And those stories show women as moral actors, because when we think of the Quran, we have to consider that the major plot of the Quran is one of salvation or damnation. And I don't know if you want to come in now, Feras, and talk about that, about the afterlife as framing every single thing that happens in the Quran. It's the afterlife that frames everything. And this is where I think, with Professor Kausama's comments about Islamic feminist theory based on the postulate of gender equality has reached a dead end. But I think that may be the wrong lens to look at it through, because the Quran never assumes that there's going to be absolute equality in the world between anyone. There are also slaves in the Quranic society, right? And it doesn't do away with slavery. It says it's good to emancipate your slaves, but this is an unequal and a hierarchical society. And so that's very different from saying that actually men and women have different value, or that they have a different opportunity to get to the afterlife. They're equal in the most fundamental sense, and this comes out in the stories and in the major plot. So I don't know, Feras, do you want to come in and say something about that, about the major, about afterlife? The afterlife is framing everything in the Quran.
Yeah, I do. I just want to slightly change the emphasis of the point, though.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. The afterlife is the kind of anchor for the Quranic message, because that's the true life. That's where everybody ought to be thinking about, investing morally. But the real message is that I think the real confusion comes sometimes when we confuse the idea of a utopia with the Quranic notion of doing good. That is to say, people generally think that the Quran, by encouraging human beings to be better persons, to be better individuals, and to strive for justice, there is some sense in which a utopia can be achieved in this world. But that's not what the Quran is saying. For then there would be no moral test. If there is a utopia, there is no moral test. And the moral test is at the heart of the Quran. And so as long as there's the last person standing on earth, there will still be a reason to do things better. because that suggests that there's still a moral space to do better. And we forget that, because we forget about the importance of the afterlife, and we think that it is, we think that there's somehow, yes, we are all working towards a better society, and we can achieve this on earth. And that's partly because of, I think, intellectual influence from other parts of the world in Muslim tradition about creating better societies, confusing that for the fact that it's not about creating better societies, but so it's striving for more justice, doing better at an individual level. And so that because if you could achieve a utopia now, if you could have paradise on earth, there would be no sense of the Quranic message. The whole point of the Quranic message is that there is no paradise on earth, because this is not the true life. This is a passing, this is a moment, an exam moment for the moral individual, because the true life, al-hayawan, as the Quran calls it in Surah Al-Ankabut, is the akhirah. But why is that the case? Well, what does that mean for us as human beings? It means that this life is a constant moral test. Every second, every moment, every interaction, every action, every thought, every feeling, absolutely every single second of this life is a moral test and has moral value, even if that moral value might be neutral. Like, shall I wear a yellow t-shirt today or a pink one? Or yellow or green, maybe that's more neutral. Everything has a value, and actually a lot of things have sacred value, and we overlook that idea. We overlook the idea that everyday life is sacred. Like everything that you do has a sacred value, because you orient yourself. That's the force of God's message in the Quran about doing things, orienting yourself in the right way, right? So أينما تولوا فثم وجه الله is not just about the Qibla. It's an orientation. It's an inner orientation that you do everything in your life that has that is consecrated. That's the word I want to say. It's consecrated
Exactly.
towards this realization that you're building, you're trying to improve your moral character in order to merit a place in the afterlife, which is the true life.
And that's why, for instance, the Quran says, that bir, that about bir, that it's not whether you're turning your face to the east and the west. It's not that the Qibla is unimportant. Of course, the Qibla is important, but it's not enough to just pray in one direction. That's not what Quranic piety is about at all. And so the point is that when we're reading verses on women, if we don't take into account this larger picture of what is Quranic morality and what does life mean and what is the very purpose of life as a moral test, then we will never understand what the Quran is saying about women. It has to be taken in the context of the Quran's larger moral message to every human being. And in that context, and then the second part of this is that, of course, the Quran is operating in a society in which there are male-headed households was the norm in late antiquity and in antiquity, and this means like all the way back from Greek and Roman times. There was somebody called a paterfamilias, the male head of household, who even had a legal status, right? And so how is the Quran addressing this person? Is it giving him all the rights over women, which is commonly how it's read today? I mean, how we read it today is, oh, men have more inheritance, therefore men are better than women. No, that's not at all what the Quran was saying in its own time. What it was saying is that actually, men, you in a context in which there are male heads of household, those male heads of household had better look after every single person in their care, including all the women. And if they don't, they face their own damnation from that. That becomes a matter of moral significance and of salvific significance, is that whether or not they're actually looking after the vulnerable people in their care, it becomes a matter of moral significance. Now, for today, does that mean that all households have to be headed by men today? No, that's not at all the Quranic perspective. That's not what we're talking about at all. What we're saying is that to understand what happens in the Quran with regard to women, it's important to understand what that society looked like. It was a patronage society where if you did favors for somebody more powerful from you than you could expect favors in return or protection in return. And the Quran overturns that by saying, actually, God is the patron. So you do favors for everybody. You do favors, you look after everybody beneath you, but you expect nothing in return from them. What you're going to get in return is salvation in the afterlife, right? And equally, women have the absolute moral agency to do good in whatever situation they find themselves in, as do slaves, as does everybody in that society. And I think that it's an important point to make about moral agency and free will, Feras. Do you want to say something about that, or did you want to say something else?
No, I think we've since lost the parameters of the question of our dear do you want us to concentrate on move on to another section, or but I mean everything's kind of interwoven. We can come back to certain points, but maybe just leave it at that.
Hamdi, what would you like us to talk about?
Yeah, actually, thank you so much for your elaboration, and there have been so many things that we have discussed that you have explained to us within the book. And actually, I'm curious about that you said the free will in the Quran, because you because I think you have elaborated this in the introduction also. So what do you think about the free will in the Quran? Maybe, yeah, that's my question.
Well, I mean, okay, so let me then just follow on what Karen was saying. I think it's absolutely crystal clear that the idea of free will in the Quran is fundamental. Adam chooses to along with Eve to kind of eat of the tree, right? لا تقرب هذه الشجرة. They choose free will, and God gives that free will. But that free will comes at a great cost. The cost, the potential risk of moral failure. It comes at a great risk, that is to say. But that's the price paid. For the one creature that is given free will, that's the price to pay, that there is a moral test. You could get things wrong, get them right, you could get them wrong. But that's what we ask for as a human species, according to the Quran. And so that's if we wanna have that free will, then have it. The Quran says, but then you have to make choices. Okay.
Exactly. The mountains don't have a choice, right? When the mountains see God, they crumble. They have no choice. There is nothing that they can't do anything about it. And at the end of the day, everybody returns to God prostrating, whether they want to or not, right? However, as we know from the verses on the afterlife, some people will wish that they had made different moral choices. And who are they going to try to blame? They're going to try to blame the powerful people in society, aren't they? They're going to say, wait a minute, we were just following you. Now, I have no idea about Indonesia, and I'm not going to say anything about Indonesia. But when I look around the West, I see people like Elon Musk, right? Powerful person, right? I'm going to tell you something. That's not the sort of person that I would follow morally. Okay. I'm not going to go into his personal life. You can read about it in newspapers but just even how he treats his employees, firing loads of employees without giving them any notice, and how he treats the environment, deciding to go up into space rather than feed the poor or, look after people, right? I mean, so the Quran addresses that exact situation of these powerful people in society who everybody kind of thinks are amazing. Wow, look at that person. And if you follow them, you can follow them at your peril, because what you should be following is God's word and the righteous people, right? And every single person, the thing is that without free will, the moral test and the Quran describes the life of this world as a moral test explicitly in many passages of Bala, right? It's a moral test. And so without free will, that moral test would be nothing. But we know from Adam and Eve that the free will that free will exists, that God created us in order to be able, with the senses, with the faculties of heart and eyes and hearing, in order to be able to make valid moral choices. And we have the possibility of making those choices, or of making or of seeking the gains of solely of the life of this world, right? And so where that comes into the gender discourse is that actually it means that women, even in the household of any kind of powerful man, like Pharaoh's wife in the household of Pharaoh, she still has the ability to make her own moral choices. Even though he's right off the rails, she can decide to be a good believer. And we see that mentioned in a tahrim, right? And then we also see Mary having to go away from her ahl in order to make the moral choices and in order to be closer to God, right? And then we also see that the wife of Lot, and who was under, it uses the word taht, it means under the protection of the righteous servant Lot. But of course, she made a different moral choice, right? So it doesn't matter. These social hierarchies don't matter for your ability to make proper moral choices. I don't know if you want to say more about that and gender. And what we find, maybe we should mention about the plots and the ability for repentance. Feras, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, because again, this point about the moral test, that is the hayat dunya, the life of this world, as a moral test, a test of your moral worth. So every human being has a value, and that value essentially is moral value. So it is to do with their openness to God's guidance, their akhlaq with other creatures, and so on. That moral value, if that's going to be a fair test from God, then that moral value must suggest that we have the ability to be moral. And so that comes back to free will. But to an important additional point, which is that what kind of person has moral ability, the capacity to be moral? And that's what we call moral agency, the ability to act to make moral choices that are correct. And I think the Quranic stories that are presented, and in which women frequently make a very important, kind of central characters, as Karen was about to illustrate, such as the Queen of Sheba, and of course Mary and others. The point there is to show that in any possible situation, there is moral agency. There is the capacity to make a moral choice, even if it's the choice to feel or to have a good thought, to have a pious feeling, or to have a good thought, or to have a good aspiration, even if you can't quite get there. But all of that is moral agency. It's showing God that you are making the right kind of moral choices. And so moral agency is a very important concept in the Quran. It doesn't have a word, it doesn't have a phrase or anything, but it's our way of capturing some of those, the purpose of some of those major stories in the Quran.
And so what we see in the Quran is that we see the stories following three different trajectories. What we see first is the trajectory of, there are two different trajectories of salvation, right? The first trajectory of salvation would be the trajectory of what you might call sabr, right? This is somebody who endures a lot of hardship, and then because of enduring that hardship is saved. And this is Mary, it's Joseph, it's a lot of different people who display sabr. Another trajectory is the Adam and Eve trajectory, the Queen of Sheba, Zuleika, or Joseph. And that's the trajectory of wrongdoing and then repentance. So there are certain characters who will be doing wrong, and even Abraham, right? He worships first. He looks at, what does he look at? He looks at the sun. And then he looks at the moon, and he's looking at different, or no, he looks at that, sorry, it's the star, the moon, the sun. And so he's looking at these different things, and then he has the realization, oh no, what I need to worship is the creator of all of that, right? And so many, many characters in the Quran, male and female, go through a moment where they realize they've gotten it wrong, and they need to change their way, and they need to ask God they need to repent to God, okay? And for instance, we see that with Moses, when Moses kills a man, and then he realizes, what does he realize? Zalamtu nafsi, right? It's the zulm nafs. It's that actually by killing someone else, by wronging another person, he's harmed himself. And so that's a key crucial point. And then the third trajectory, of course, is the trajectory of damnation. And that would be the person who never repents. That would be Pharaoh. He repents at the last minute, but he's actually an example for everybody that you can't do a deathbed repentance. You have to actually make an effort to act well in the life. So I don't know,
Okay.
Hamdi,
Yeah.
do you have more that you want to, I mean,
Thank you.
we've now, yeah. Is that clear about free will, do you think?
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you so much. So what we've got is that, yeah, you have talked about moral agency and then the free will, and so many things related to how the Quran emphasizes on the moral people or humans being have to take consideration on the moral agency. And something that that I want to ask or to clarify is that, how about the laws in the Quran? Because in traditional tafsir, we have so many things talking about ayatul ahkam, about the law. And also you in the introduction, you also mentioned this. You said yet Quranic law is not entirely akin to a secular legal system, nor is it synonymous with what later become Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. And then you also said our expansive notion of law reflects our position that there is no separation of law from ethics in the Quran. So I want to underline these words, no separation of law from ethics in the Quran. So could you elaborate more? What do you mean by no separation of law from ethics in the Quran? Because yeah, we know that in traditional tafsir, law is something that is legal, and in daily Muslim activities, they regard law as something very significant in the in Islam. So yeah, could you please elaborate this more?
Yeah, we would love to elaborate that more. In fact, we wrote a whole article elaborating more on this, except it's not yet published. So we will have to send it to you once it is published, and you can distribute it to your networks, I hope.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we too realize that this point in the book is not fully elaborated enough. And actually, the question of what is law and what is ethics is a very complicated one, okay? In late antiquity, when you think about God's book, what would you think about the commands in that book? Do you think that, so how tafsir and fiqh had to take this is that some of it is law that can be enforced on this realm, and some of it is not, right? Some of it can only be enforced by God. And that's also true in the Quran. There's very, very, very little, however, that can be enforced in this worldly realm, I think. There's very little that law in the Quran that specifies some kind of punishment in this realm. And I think that there's a reason for that. And that is because those are kind of very egregious things, like zina, or, you know, like these really, really egregious things that are kind of a very, zina witnessed by 4 people. Okay, not just something that happens behind closed doors, witnessed by 4 people, like an act that is that outrageous, it witnessed by 4 people. You have to imagine yourself in the 7th century. This is something very, very egregious against what you would call public morality, which used to be a kind of thing in those days. Okay, so what we mean when we say that there's no separation between ethics and law is we mean that the ethics, that actually law is graded, and that the ethics themselves, what we would call ethics, like idfa billati hiya ahsan, for instance, like this is kind of, you would think, well, how do you legislate that? Idfa billati hiya ahsan. How do you say that's but what we would like to say is that the Quran presents a divine law, something that God is judging, not something that humans have to judge, right? And in this divine law, everybody should try to hold themselves to the highest possible account, okay? And that actually you're constantly obligated to try to do better in this, rather than always only trying to see what you can get away with. And the problem is that, I mean, Feras, you should probably jump in, because I might just like have a very long monologue here, but but because what you have in secular societies is you have a law that regulates wrongdoing. If I steal an apple from the shop, which I won't do, don't worry, but if I stole an apple from the shop, I mean, it would be a misdemeanor charge. If I kill somebody, it would be a major crime, and I would be put in prison for a very, very long time, right? There are grades of doing wrong. But in the Quran, there are grades of doing right. And we can't say that you're not obligated to do better if you can. And this is why we think it's a mistake to think there's some kind of legal minimum, and those things are like, you can do that and still be okay. Is that a good way of expressing it, Firas? Or I feel that you could add something here, because I feel that maybe you can add
No,
subtlety.
it's not an easy landscape to navigate, partly because we are describing it right very now using terminology that comes from a historical experience that is in the main modern English, which has had a historical experience of separating ethics from morality from law. And the Quran has no such separations, because the purpose of the Quran is to make people lead better lives. And so don't do this, do that, do better than that. That's all interwoven in the Quran. There is there is no, for example, one of the givens of modern life is that if you are law abiding as a citizen, whatever you think or do in your private time doesn't matter. No, it matters in the Quran. You can't lead these double or multiple lives, whether these are intellectual lives or emotional lives or sexual lives or whatever, social lives, professional lives at work. They all have to be united. This is a sense of the kind of uniting things for the one that is the one, you know. So I think the language of modernity, of modern English intellectual language, allows us to categorize things like ethical, legal, positive law, moral law. All of that is language which creates barriers to truly understanding the approach of the Quran, which doesn't require like words like ethics or morality, or it understands a certain a certain level of kind of piety that there. Yes, that's not to say, by the way, that the Quran doesn't have any don'ts, like Karen was saying. I mean, there are sort of the equivalent of commandments. There are equivalent of things that are base level you should never do. But we have to kind of think about contextual questions, because I mean, there is, as everybody knows, even the things that are like the laws against dietary laws can be infringed in case of dire need or emergency. So I think the big sense in the Quran is that the jurisprudential body has not quite moved since the 7th century. But the important thing about that is, go ahead.
And so why this matters for women is because, of course, you have these verses like Quran 4:3 that talk about, if you think that talk about the orphans, and if you think that you're not going to be able to look after them, then marry the women, 2 or 3, right, or 4. And then what happens is that tiny snippet is taken completely out of context and is given, then is put, giving men this right kind of through all of time to somehow marry 4 women. And whereas in its own context of Surat An-Nisa, what we're talking about is, first of all, we're talking about a society in which women could not just get divorced and live alone, in which women would live in the households of men, right? If you got divorced, you would, if say, God forbid, I were to get divorced from my husband, you know, I wouldn't be able to just go off and live alone. I would be going off to my male relative to live, right? My father, maybe even my son, you know, right? I would not be able to live alone as a woman. So you have all these women who are in the households, right? And so and then you have the male head of household who could potentially take advantage of them and completely take advantage of them because they're vulnerable. So what is the Quran doing in that instance? It's just saying, if you think that you're going to take advantage of them, just don't. Just marry them properly, give them a dowry, and then at least they have some financial security. It's saying, look, if you think that women can be disinherited, don't disinherit them. They need to get a proper inheritance. But it's not saying, oh, this is ideal. In fact, it says this is not ideal. Later on in An-Nisa, it says, for instance, that you will never be able to be equal between more than one, right? And so if you're not going to be able to be equal between more than one, then in what circumstance is it good to marry more than one? Only in the case of dire need or dire necessity is that appropriate, right? And of course, in these days, when women can make their own money or when there's a state system to support them, we're talking about a tribal society, a stateless society where there was no welfare to be able to support women. You know, these days, maybe the situation has changed. But the problem then being is that fiqh made that pronouncement into something that it wasn't in the first place. And then that's solidified and calcified and hardened over time into something that it was never intended to be. I mean, we know that the Quran does not want to cause harm. And, you know, we know that that's a situation of the Quran. It's trying to help people live better lives or more righteous lives. I don't know.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
I think I just because I noticed in the chat, Hamdi, a question
Go
by
ahead.
Abdullah Kafabihi. Yeah, a very eloquently phrased question about egalitarian notions. I think Abdullah, the one answer is what just Karen just gave, that verse on the orphans and marrying wives. For some reason, the patriarchal audience, the society of the time, everybody thought, oh, well, I can be one of those because I'm male. And the point of the Quran is not just that you're male, it's that you're male in a position of power and wealth to do something good. And so you
Yeah.
get two responses. Everybody who thinks he's a male thinks he can just do what they do. And then everybody who thinks he's rich thinks he could do what they do, right? Because they think, well, I'm rich, I can afford to have 2, 3, 4 wives. And they forget about the moral message in that. So there's a lot of that. I don't know if you can think of other
So, yeah,
context.
I am, because I'm thinking about the verses on divorce. For instance, we see a lot of times people look at the verses on divorce and they think, what this does is it grants men a power of divorce, right? Okay. I think that what was going on in those verses, our reading of what was going on in those verses, is that men already had that power. And then what it was doing, the Quran is doing, is saying you cannot just disregard women in this instance. You must give them a proper, you know, their proper maintenance for a certain period. You must take it very, very seriously. And the thing is, the problem with the idea of just thinking that there's a legal minimum and then that's a minimum moral action, I can't quite describe it, but how it tends to be interpreted is that people will take that thing, like marry 2 or 3 or 4, out of context and then count that as a kind of legal permission, whereas actually that was meant as a safeguard against something much, much worse, which would be that the women in the household might be taken advantage of by this very bad man or something. You know, this very bad man could do very bad things because he's got the power in the household. So he's not supposed to do those bad things, right? You know, and rather than being granting a permission, it's kind of setting a warning and a boundary. And the problem is that people take those boundaries as permissions, right? So what in the divorce verses, there are basic boundaries to say you cannot treat women really that badly. And people, rather than reading those as the boundary of the minimum standard of behavior, which would be not even that great morally, right? They take it as a permission for like, that's the maximum standard of behavior, but that's not what the Quran is saying. And that's ultimately why we would question the boundary between law and ethics. Because if you think that the minimum standards are actually the maximum, are actually a granting permission, then you'll always be seeing what more you can get out of other people. Oh, how can I use this to my advantage? How can I get more out of this situation? And that's exactly what the Mufassirun and the Fuqaha ended up doing, right? For men, to advantage men. Whereas actually what the Quran is saying, or as Feras would say, what God is saying in the Quran, is actually the basic minimum is not the most you can do. You should always be striving for higher morality. And actually that's obligatory on you to strive for a higher morality. If you can't you'll never actually be equitable among more than one. So you just look after that one wife and look after her very well. That's the moral message going on there. But you see, they weren't interested in looking at those morals and making those laws, right? And so that's ultimately, I think, where reformists or modernists could apply that ultimate egalitarianism to today, right? You could say, well, in its own time, it was merely setting up boundaries against really bad behavior, right? But today we can move forward. We could look at the more equal ways of looking at things. And I don't know if that's a great answer because, of course, I don't know that I'm really the best person to speak to give the most reformist interpretations, but I don't know if Hamdi or if Feras has something to add.
That's very great answers from both of you. Thank you so much. And actually, before this discussion began, the committee has provided a form to compile some questions from the expected audiences, and there were no lesser than 25 questions being provided, but because we have limited time, I just selected some of the questions, but about of the selected ones, I'm not sure that we can accommodate all those questions, so I just want to read one or two questions from the audience. So this is a very good question. This is from Nur Alia Fatin from Al Azhar University in Cairo. The question is: are there boundaries in the Quran for women to fight for their rights, such as towards their husbands or male parents, or male parents, or are there specific capacities in which women are allowed to fight for their rights? Because previously you have explained about the limits for men, for example, but are there also limits for women in the Quran, or how do you see this based on your approach?
Okay, so fighting for their rights. Firas, do you wanna start?
I don't
Or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, I think you will take this up, but I just want to say that I think okay, so first of all, the problem is not just the Quran in the context in which your questioner has posed her question is not gonna, so it's important to know that the Quran seeks justice for men and women regardless. It doesn't have a kind of, it doesn't want to distinguish between, there is no such thing as male supremacy. It doesn't make sense, right? So the question is, does the context, the jurisprudential context in which that woman who's asked you the question lives, is there anything that can help her there? Because of course the Quran is appropriated by a jurisprudential tradition, people with authority and people who can invalidate what she might say. So I'm wary of thinking that there's a particular verse or other that, other than the entirety of the Quran, is for justice. And so how can it be for justice while oppressing women? And I think that's actually been the problem with the jurisprudential tradition in general, for all of the perhaps positive aspects of trying to acquire a language of rationality by which to argue for the benefit and the welfare of human beings. How often have you heard the questions say, well, what do you think of the Quran on women? And people from tradition itself quickly jump and say, well, the Quran came to liberate women. Well, then how is it that then all that has happened since the 7th, 8th century is that many women, enough women, have felt oppressed by the jurisprudential tradition? So there is a misalignment there. There's certainly a misalignment. But Karen, you might want to bring in some other tips from the Quranic text.
I give a misalignment. What ends up happening is a text that did mean to bring in rights for women and treat them with dignity and treat them with respect ends up being used to do the opposite. And that is the misalignment. And that came about because, of course, the authors of fiqh and tafsir, I mean, the problem is that in patronage societies is that maybe in any society, what people are really looking out for is their own rights, and they don't really want to give rights to the disadvantaged necessarily if they have a precarious hold on power themselves, right? So you have these scholars who have a precarious hold on power. They say, my way is the only way. No women can join this group. Minorities, religious minorities, no, I know what the truth is. And it's this narrow thing, right? And whereas actually in the Quran's own time, of course, it was looking for justice for the poor, the oppressed, the women, all of the oppressed in society, really. There was a sense in which God is looking out for those people. And it's that spirit of that hasn't been carried through. So how to use the Quran today in terms of I think that the argument would have to be made that certain laws in the Quran are really based on their own on that specific tribal society, and that are certain rules, and that actually the Quran always mandates that you can do better than that. So why not with our laws today do better than that, right? Because it was speaking to that society, and as Feras says, but what happened is it went backwards. It's not even that it went actually backwards. I'm sorry, but laws that say women can't exit the house, I mean, women were exiting the house. Why else would they have to wear their cloaks over themselves, right? They were, a woman was speaking alone with the Prophet in Al-Mujadila. She's speaking alone with him. They're speaking alone in a room because it uses the dual and says, God is the witness to your speech, the two of you, right? And so that's an unrelated man and woman because she's complaining about her husband. So how on earth could it be that it's not okay today for people who have nothing but proper intentions in their heart to just have an appropriate conversation about whatever matter, a professional conversation, you'd say, or a spiritual conversation, alone, the two of them? I mean, it's just the Quran itself is treating women as dignified human beings and human members of society who also have the right or who have the obligation to amar bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, right? The women are supposed to do that as well. And yet in the fiqh, it was taken that that's that's really only a male obligation. I don't see how they got that from the Quran. It's not there. It's a women are supposed to do that as well. It's in the feminine even, right? And so
I agree with Karen wholeheartedly. I think one is scandalized by the way in which the Quranic narrative, the message itself, has almost been turned upside down. I mean, how can you conceive that God wants justice for men and women and not to have them partners in absolutely everything? It doesn't work. Unless
Yeah.
God wants to oppress women, that's what you're saying. That's actually what you're saying. There is no way that God wants justice and he will oppress one of the two pairs that he's created. It doesn't make sense. I read somewhere actually recently that something like 60% of the workers during the time of the Industrial Revolution in England were women. So are you saying to me that women can just be discarded with, they can stay at home? I mean, we need a leap like that in Muslim kind of intellectual thought of the size of, we haven't. You see how there was an industrial revolution and it took, a whole leap into the modern world in which, by the way, in which all Muslims are comfortable. And that's the irony here. No Muslim here really lives according to any aspiration of jurisprudence, however pious they are. Every single male and female Muslim in modernity today lives with an aspiration towards justice, and that justice has actually come in the major part from the emancipation of women in the West, not in the other parts of the world. So that's the kind of irony for you.
Yeah,
Professor
it's
Karen and Professor Feras, can I interrupt?
Sure.
Okay. Yes, very interesting discussion. I really enjoy it very much. But there is one point I would like to ask to both of you. I think Muhammad Shahrur has put up a theory of meaning in the Quran, which he called the theory of limitation. And through this theory of limitation, he tried to put that the message of the Quran was set up in a dimension from the minimal limitation into the higher or ideal. I call it ideal standard of the Quran, of the message of the Quran. So, for example, we know that in reality, the reality never the same, and to us the reality, for example, to us women to be equal with men need process, and the process to make that everybody has consciousness, equal and justice consciousness is not easy. So Shahrur identified that Quran give two messages, give uh, a rank of messages from very practical into very ideal. The Quran accept the hierarchical morality in gender relation because the society is just there. But the Quran asks them to get better morality every time. And through process, they directed toward an ideal position, which is equal and justice. How do you see about this theory,
We
Professor?
write about this, Professor Kosmano. We actually say that I think Karen and I came to the same conclusions in our work, that
Okay.
actually the Quran wants to do better. It asks them to think. The slave girl, I think, is the best example of freeing the slaves. Let the slave girls marry. Perhaps they will have their own pious families. There will be the source of more good in the world. So free your slaves. But it was doing it process. That's precisely why I think the Quran has been misread, because it's not, we're supposed to understand from the Quranic story precisely, good word to use, what you said, process.
Yes.
So the
Quran
Quran gives,
appreciate process.
but the Quran shows, which is history, that's what being historical means. And I
Okay.
think our jurisprudential tradition has never been historical. It's stuck in a non-historical moment in time. And I think, but the point about Shahrur, I think more importantly, Professor Osman, is that we need like 100 Shahrurs. We need to have them in curricula. We need to have you know, not just Shahruz, but like the female equivalent of Shahruz. We need a whole list, a reading list of people who are thinking on their own. And for that to be taught at schools, for Muslims, like everybody here in this crowd, 122 participants, to have their own views and to be discussing them. And that's the process by which things get better. It's not by, you know, latching onto one thinker or one new idea. Actually, frequently why people latch on to one, and I'm not saying you, but I'm just saying frequently why somebody like Shahrur becomes a kind of celebrity is because there's so few. People think, oh my God, finally somebody's saying something interesting or something more in tune with modern times or with modernity or with process or with historical process and so on. So that I agree with you. I think that's what we're trying to say. When we did the chronological thing, we wanted to show process. We
Okay.
wanted to show how women become partners.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Very good.
Another thing about process is that and law, which I completely forgot to mention before, even though I talked a lot, was that actually you can see that certain things that you would count as law in the Quran are only temporary. Okay. And proof of this. Okay, I think it's proof. So for instance, it was always taken by the jurisprudential tradition that the Quran moved to a more warlike state over time, okay? And that the Medinan verses abrogated the Meccan verses on peace and on, you know, whatever. Okay, and actually what we see in the Medinan period is we see a very few verses in very specific contexts that say, okay, so in the Meccan period, of course, what we see, and in the Medinan period, we see a lot of the requirements to attain the afterlife, to attain a good afterlife, are things like giving zakat, being a good person, praying, believing in God, right? A very kind of simple set of requirements, right? You have to be generous and be a good person, and that's a simple set of requirements. Then suddenly in the Medinan period, you have a few verses that say, but if you're not with us, then you're against us, kind of, right? If you're not fighting with us and you're turning your back, then that's it. You face this, you could face God's wrath for this kind of thing, right? And those tiny verses, those few verses have been taken to be somehow have been magnified by the tradition. But actually, we can see that those verses applied to a very specific condition in which at that moment it was necessary to stand together. And how do we know that? Because then if we look at other verses that seem to have nothing to do with war, but that are also Medinan, like Al-Mumtahana, right? That's a surah that has the longest mean verse length and so is considered to be an extremely late surah. What's happening there with the unbelievers? What's happening there is that the believers are being told, we know that you have unbelievers that you love. And then there are women who might be with the unbelievers and they're believers now. They can come over and leave their unbelieving husbands. If your wives are unbelievers and you are believers, you should let them go. They can just go, right? Talk about freedom of movement. Like, this is not men having control over women. But more importantly than that, for the issue of jihad is or holy war, which I don't like calling jihad, actually, I shouldn't have used that word, is that actually then the male believers and the male unbelievers start to negotiate with each other. Okay, I paid this much for the dowry of this one. Okay, you're supposed to give it to them, and then they're supposed to give it back to you. There's an actual negotiation going on here. They're not looking at them and saying, oh, you're unbelievers, we're going to kill you. Either their wives who are unbelievers or the unbelievers that they're negotiating with. And this is a very, very late surah. You can see that on the whole, what's going on in the Quran is relationships with others that are peaceable, right? And then what happens in very specific situations is that you have to come together as a community and fight. But those cannot be considered to abrogate all of the other situations. No, what we have to say is that actually it's an occurrence of a temporary law. Just like the COVID laws, at least in the UK, you had to have an imposition of temporary restrictions for a situation of emergency. Then it went, right? And so it's again a situation where we can see that the Quran itself was allowing for for specific societal situations and for a change in society, changing circumstances. It was allowing for circumstance. And today it's taken as though it's a simple, hard, and calcified thing, you know, and that's just not how it was at the time.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you very
So
much.
Yeah.
thank you, Professor Kusmana, for the question, and Dr. Feras and Dr. Karen for the answers. We still have 15 minutes left. I don't know whether you are okay with the additional time, because what we have agreed before was about 1 hour, 1 hour and a half for this webinar. But you know that the participants are above 100 participants, which is very, very huge number. Yeah, there are so many questions appearing. So there is an interesting question in the chat. Maybe Dr. Karen and Feras, you can also see the question from Duhalut Villa.
Yes,
Question of
yeah.
your sexuality and gender. Perhaps if you wish
Oh,
to,
yeah, for sexuality.
yeah.
That's a really great question. So essentially what we see in the Quran, of course, is we see the story of Lot, and that is a story that's also in the Bible. And you know, you have in that story, of course, the men coming to men. What do you come to men and not to women, right? And so over time, that's been interpreted to mean that that queer sexuality is entirely outlawed. Okay, now I don't know that I would say that it's let's see how to put it. Okay, what I tell my students is, what I sometimes say about this situation is that actually we have to imagine a time in which the household was really important, and it was really important to have children, okay? In that day and age, it was extremely important to have households where there were children, because of course the Muslims are under siege and they're a very, very small community and they need to grow, okay? So on the one hand, you have the context of the household being extremely important and the need for reproduction. And this day and age, of course, in this country anyway, couples, no matter what gender they are, can say adopt children who need to be adopted and looked after. And this is a situation in which there's a household, no matter the gender of the people. We don't know now what the Quran would say today about such situations, whether that was specific for the time or whether that was because of the importance of households and the real need for reproduction and for a space that made it safe for everybody to for the vulnerable members of society. The other thing that I often think about this question is that the Quran was really very interested in the most vulnerable members of society. And it's a text where it's very, very clear that what happens in people's private, behind the closed doors, is between them and God. It's not for anyone else to look behind those closed doors. You're supposed to knock. You're supposed to announce your presence. You're supposed to say, hello, I'm here, not just barge into any houses and start looking and prying into other people's business. So I think even if in the 7th century, which is really a long time ago, and it's a time when everybody knew each other's business, right? It's when everybody knew where everybody else was in these very small societies, right? Everybody knew what was going on. If 2 people went off over there, you'd say, oh, those people are going off. And actually the Quran is trying to discourage that kind of thing. It's saying, don't speak about people behind their backs. Don't pry into things that aren't your business. And so there's something where I'd say that you do have precedent in the Quran for things being able to develop over time, or for the rules that applied back then to not apply. We know that in that day and age, it was extremely important to have households. We know that these days households might look very different. There are many female-headed households these days, and don't tell me there aren't. There too. There are everywhere in the world, female-headed households, and it's a very different world that we see here. And so we don't know. I mean, I can't say that I know absolutely anything about what the Quran would say today, but I know that there's the possibility of changing, but much, much more importantly, I know that the underlying premise of the Quran is not to punish people where their business is between them and God. And so it's not that society should step in and mandate things or that people should pry into things that are personal and try to get involved in those sorts of things. So I don't know if that's a great answer. I don't know if Firas, you have something else that you want to add.
No, I think, you know, it's not for us, for me and Karen to add this, but this is for Muslim society to answer, had it had the time to develop intellectually in the way that the Western tradition has developed to be able to answer back. I mean, it's just simply that you are asking us to give you answers from the 7th century, but the Quran itself shows process and so shows justice. So there's never an excuse for causing harm or any kind of harassment to other human beings, because the individual freedom is sacred in the Quran. But for the same reason that actually it's nothing to do with queer sexuality, any kind of flaunting or tabarruj in the Quran is anyway prohibited, and you have enough of that in modern society. We don't seem to have a problem with that, so we should have a problem with that as well, according to the Quran. I mean, you know, the kind of pornography that we see that is, you know, heterosexual is just it's a major area of concern that's not been treated. So
Yeah, absolutely. Like I completely agree with that. And of course, we know that there are interpreters who have put forth interpretations that actually this was by force with lots of guests, and that this kind of interpretation as well. So this is happening, but very little. And what pains me is that you know, is that people are being put in very you know, even life-threatening situations, and that I think that using the Quran to cause people harm is exactly it shouldn't be used in that way, I think. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. So we still have a lot of questions, but I should choose one.
Religious
So there is,
women's
sorry.
religious authority. There's one on women's religious authority. Should we tackle that, or what do you?
Yeah. If you wish, yeah, you could go for that. So how does this book's perspective on women's religious authority compare with other scholarly works on gender in Islam? Maybe what are the differences between your works and others works on gender in Islam? Maybe
Yeah.
that's
yeah.
a question for Karen for sure, because she's been in that field longer than I could
Yeah.
pretend.
We wouldn't look at women's religious authority as separate from male religious authority necessarily. I think that people make a mistake when they say only study male prophets in the Quran, because they're not taking into account that actually all humans in the Quran that are mentioned by name or like mentioned as characters are actually setting forth moral examples. Sometimes they're bad moral examples and sometimes they're good moral examples. Like we have the example of Mary exercising sabr, and we have the example of Joseph exercising sabr. And we don't see that there's some kind of, the Quran is not saying that women specifically are barred from any kind of authority. In fact, it shows them as examples. We have the example of the prophet's wives who are asked to stick with him or go, or he's going to let them go freely, right? Incidentally, another example of where divorce is not, he's supposed to let them go if they want to go, right? Okay, so like he's told that, God tells him that, you know, or he says, you know, you can go if you want to go. And people look at this as an example of the male authority over women. But of course, they're actually an example for every single believer. Every believer has the choice, a male or female, to either stick with the prophet's, the law, God's law that the prophet is imparting, or to go, right? So they're not, I think that the major message of the Quran is not about specific gender in authority. It's about moral agency. I don't know if you have
that moral agency is ungendered. It's absolutely clear that that's the case. And by the way, on authority in a kind of and in the Quran, I mean, Karen, in the Surah Al-Naml, right? 27, I think.
Yeah.
The Queen of Sheba. I mean, what an example of a woman in authority acting. You see that transformation that she undergoes is completely different to the example set by a pharaoh, who's a male figure, who's hardened and obstinate, and she's only given one, she has one interaction, and then she realizes the error of her ways. She has that wisdom. Pharaoh's given a million chances and he won't budge. So, I
Yeah.
mean, you don't need a better justification of the possibility of female authority than the story of the Malakat. What does the Quran say? إني وجدت امرأة تملكهم
Yeah.
وأوتيت من كل. I mean, it's a brilliant story, often missed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's another one there. In your opinion, how does the Quran's idea of the Day of Judgment influence the pattern of patronage of piety in household management in Muslim communities? What do you think about that, Firas? Do you see that one, Layla?
I'm just trying to read it now. In your opinion, how does that piety?
Well, and she's asking, how is the intertextuality between the Quran and the Bible related to the concept of patronage of piety in household management?
Well, okay, so on the first one, I think you can take the second one, Karen. On the first one, the idea of being a patron of piety is to be an exemplar, is to be able to do more good and to encourage others to do more good by doing, acting as an exemplar. And so, when you have powerful people in society, they have the power to influence. And look at us, we live in a world of influencers, right? Are they the right kind of influencers? God knows. Only God knows. But that's the position of the Quran, that when you have not just agency, you have social clout, social capital, you have the ability to influence others. That's a huge responsibility, because at risk is not just your own salvation, but that potentially of others. I mean, of course, the Quran makes a mockery of the whole scene by, as Karen said, people say, "Oh, well, we just followed you guys," and they said, and then the so-called patrons say back to them, "Well, nobody told you to follow us. You're the idiots. You didn't think for yourselves, right?" And so that's a kind of thing that has to be avoided. So I think the idea of patronage of piety for us is that anybody can be a patron of piety, and by anybody, rich, poor, male, female, anybody.
Exactly. So
And that's premised on the idea of a judgment coming, because God will judge. So it's very much fulcrum.
Exactly. So it's in a sense a mistake to look at these examples of female agency and think that they relate only to households, right? Because of course, women are supposed to they're supposed to command right and forbid wrong, right? As I mentioned before. And I think that that's a key point that's often missed, because of course, in the legal and tafsir tradition, it was assumed that women's place was solely in the home as a patron, in a sense, like never that they're. However, what we have to think about is households as actually the center of society. There aren't institutions outside of the household. There's no social club that you go to or something outside of the household. There's no university. In fact, all teaching happens within households, probably, and all learning happens within, and maybe the mosque as well, right? And the streets and the marketplaces, right? So these are the I guess you would say, the training ground. That would be a Feras Hamza sort of phrase. It's real life and it's daily life, even that is the kind of training ground for the soul. And so even if we were to think of households as being enclosed spaces, I mean, as being the space in which women are most often seen, even if that were the case, actually households have porous boundaries. There are outsiders coming in all the time. There are unrelated people all around. And there's always a chance for every person within whatever sphere they find themselves to be a patron, right? And that can mean for the rich, being a financial patron, of course, looking after the poor and not expecting anything in return. Remember that, because of course, that's what the prophets were not supposed to expect anything in return, were they? They're supposed to give and not expect anything in return. And that's the same of all worldly patronage. You're supposed to not expect anything for the charity that you give. And that includes any kind of moral goodness. You know, saying a kind word can be an act of charity. And isn't it true that the sadaqah, what's that verse from Baqarah, Feras, which the sadaqah followed by the, you know, it's like, do you know what I mean? That
Yeah, the men, like, you know, making it clear that you're doing somebody a favor, and so kind of asking.
When you follow a sadaqah with harmful words, then it kind of nullifies it. It's not a good, that's no longer the proper thing anymore, is it? It's that actually you have to give through generosity, and that kind of giving can be anything, right? As long as it's a moral goodness as the giving, and so I think that I wouldn't restrict any of this to a matter of household management at all. This is a kind of life management, right? And yeah, I don't know if that, Hamdi, if
Alright.
you have more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you so much for the answers, and I think we need to close the because the time is already 9 p.m. in Indonesia. How do you think, Dr. Karen and Dr. Feras, do you want to still answer the questions, or we keep it for the
Yeah,
future?
I think it's been, as I kind of expressed to you and Fawzi, I think with Karen present, I think if the audience are inspired to take one or two things away from this, that's probably a sufficient aspiration for us, and a gratifying result, as opposed to overloading them. I mean, we're happy to do future, I think, right, Karen, we could do future talks with the same audience, but I think not to overload our very, very busy and bandwidth deprived lives. So let's I'm happy to leave it here, I think, if Karen is also.
Thank you
of the
very
same.
much.
And we have to say
And
we're extremely grateful for this opportunity. We would never have gotten to all of you, and thank you all for attending. And you know, thank you, Kausama, for the introduction, the you know, wonderful contextualizing introduction. We're really, really grateful for this opportunity to connect with you all, people that we would never have normally had the opportunity to speak to or connect with. And so, yeah, we'd be very happy to continue these kinds of conversations.
Okay, thank you so much. Before I hand it back to the Master of Ceremony, do you have closing statements, Dr. Karen or Dr. Feras? Do you have a closing statement, or just do you still have? Do you want to conclude your talk, or leave?
yeah, it's always very challenging to have one final nugget of wisdom to say, but I think let's keep our eye on the ball, as I think the Quran has long been, I think, really abandoned and forgotten about for what it can actually do for Muslim societies. The very same Muslim societies that supposedly adhere to the idea that the Quran is salih li kulli zaman wa makan. I mean, if that's what Muslims believe in, they certainly haven't lived up to it. If Muslims believe that the Quran is relevant to all times and places, well, let's do something about it. Let's try and read it and see what it actually says. Outside of the jurisprudential, but I understand that not everybody has the Arabic language to do that, but really listen to the Quran. You have to get into a habit of kind of reading it over and over and over again, repeatedly, reiteratively. That's what we did. And you come, if you know, hopefully you'll be lucky enough to come to hear it speak to you. And I think it speaks words of justice, of humility, of modesty, of love, things that are sorely missing, I think, in our intellectual tradition. But yeah, that's the only thing I can say.
I think that that's a very beautiful closing, and I don't think I can improve on it at all. But just to highlight that in my observation, many people, many modern Muslims are afraid almost to have a direct relationship with the Quran themselves. they expect it to be mediated through the tradition or through, and yet I think that if I have learned anything from this experience of writing with Feras, this book, it was that actually, yeah, through just keep reading. You just have to keep reading. I'm still reading every day. You know, you just have to keep reading every day. And there's an opening that can happen then if you trust it. And if you trust that opening to happen, it can happen that that a more direct relationship can be established. And I think that yeah, then like Firas said, then we can have, you know, 100 more shahrurs and people engaging directly and having their, you know, their thoughts, and, you know, we hope. Yeah. So thank you so much for this.
Okay, so thank you to our esteemed guests, Dr. Karen and Dr. Feras, for sharing your invaluable insights and expertise with us today. Your perspectives truly enriched our discussion and offered us new ways to think about women in the Quran. We deeply appreciate the time and effort you dedicated to being here with us despite your being in holiday. And we have grateful for the knowledge and inspiration you have shared with us. And also thank you all for joining us today for this enriching book discussion. Your insights, perspective, and questions really made this session special. Now I'd like to hand the stage back to our Master of Ceremony, who will guide us through the next part of today's event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for Dr. Karen and also the Professor Feras and also Hamdi for the remarkable explanation and insights.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we close, let's take a picture together. So we do hope you to all the participants. So open your camera and then we take a picture together. So I will lead for decisions. So there are 4 slides here. So I will count till 3. So give your best smile and also your smile. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Wait. Okay. Second stage, second slide. 1, 2, 3. Third slide. 1, 2, 3. And last slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So we extend our deepest appreciation to all the incredible speakers for Dr. Karen and also the Professor Feras. I hope this is not our last meeting. We hope to another chance and also opportunities. And thank you so much for the Professor Kusmana for the beautiful insight and so the keynote speaker all the time. And thank you so much for all participants who always stay in our Zoom meeting here. We are almost of 100 and also too many people here. And thank you so much for all the institutions and the media partner for this agenda. I will mention one by one, such as the Postgraduate University of PTIK Jakarta, the Tafsir Community, the Studi Islam.id, AIAT Association, the Quran Tafsir in Indonesia, LSQH, Lingkar Studi Al-Quran Tafsir, the PKUMI, Sedekandi Insight, Sejarah Nusa, Hebat Studi Club, Studi Tafsir, Santri Mengglobal, FKMTHI, HMPS IAT Win Syarif Hidayatullah, C1 Squad, HMPS IAT Win Maliki, HMPS IAT Win Sunan Ampel, Yayan Ponorogo, Muslimah Reformis, Win Tulungagung, dan Bincang Muslimah. So thank you for all the participants here, and thank you for the outstanding speaker. So let's close audience, our meeting and our discussion today by reciting Alhamdulillah together. 1,
Bye.
2, 3.
Bye.
Thank you so much for all you. Thank you for.
Bye. Thank you. And thank you especially, Hamdi, for facilitating.
You're
You're
most
re-
welcome, Dr. Karen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye bye.